In 1933, Adolf Hitler seized power in Germany, and within 12 years, he would unleash a war that consumed the world and orchestrate the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews. Through laws, propaganda, and industrialized murder, he turned hatred into state policy. This is the story of how one man's ideology became one of history's darkest crimes against humanity. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small, unremarkable Austrian border town whose quiet streets and modest houses gave no hint that it would one day be remembered as the birthplace of one of history's most infamous figures. And in those early years he appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary boy, restless in temperament, stubborn in disposition, drifting between fleeting ambitions and repeated academic failures. The death of his father when he was 13, followed by the slow, lingering illness of his mother, left him without the steadying hand of family stability. And as a young man he wandered to Vienna with dreams of becoming an artist, only to have those ambitions shattered by repeated rejection from the Academy of Fine Arts, a humiliation that deepened his sense of alienation, feeding a growing resentment toward a world he felt had denied him his rightful place. In Vienna's cramped boarding houses and cold soup kitchen, he lived among the poor, the unemployed, and the disillusioned, absorbing the rancid air of political extremism that clung to the city's streets, where anti-Semitic pamphlets circulated freely, nationalist speeches echoed from beer halls, and the idea of racial purity was preached as a cure for every ill. Ideas that would take root in his mind and harden into the ideology that would later define his rule. By 1913, Hitler had moved to Munich, restless and aimless, yet still carrying within him that dangerous combination of wounded pride and obsessive conviction. And when the First World War erupted in 1914, he seized the opportunity to reinvent himself, enlisting in the Bavarian army, serving as a dispatch runner, surviving the mud and terror of the Western Front, and emerging from the conflict with 2 Iron Crosses, a lingering injury from a gas attack, and the belief that Germany's defeat had been the result of betrayal from within, a poisonous myth that was spreading rapidly through the ranks of returning soldiers. The collapse of the German Empire in 1918, the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, and the economic and political chaos of the Weimar Republic created fertile ground for radical movements, and it was in this turbulent environment that Hitler discovered his true talent, not as an artist but as an orator, a man capable of transforming his personal grievances into fiery speeches that electrified audiences, giving shape to their anger and offering them an enemy to blame. By joining the small obscure German Workers' Party in 1919, soon to be renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, he found the stage he had been searching for, and within just a few years he would make its ranks, reshaping it into a political weapon dedicated to his vision of a racially pure Germany, a nation reborn through discipline, unity, and the elimination of all those deemed undesirable. The journey from a failed painter in Vienna to the leader of a movement poised to seize the machinery of a modern state was swift, but it was not accidental. It was built on the careful cultivation of resentment, the relentless repetition of lies until they became accepted truth, and the promise that out of humiliation and hardship, a 1,000-year Reich could rise if only the people would follow the man who claimed to know who had wronged them and how to exact revenge. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, it marked not just the beginning of a new government, but the calculated dismantling of an entire democratic system. For within mere months, the Reichstag fire would be used as a pretext to suspend civil liberties. The Enabling Act would grant him near absolute authority, and the once fragmented Nazi Party would fuse the apparatus of the state with the ideology of National Socialism, ensuring that every lever of power, political, legal, and cultural, moved in the service of a single, ruthless vision. From the outset, this vision required an enemy that could be blamed for Germany's humiliations and hardships, and the Jews, already vilified by centuries of prejudice, were elevated to the status of existential threat, their supposed influence painted as the invisible hand behind the economic collapse, the political instability, and the loss of the Great War, a lie repeated so often through speeches, newspapers, and posters that it seeped into the very language of the nation, becoming as common as the weather and as unquestioned as gravity. By 1935, this hatred had been written into law through the Nuremberg laws, which stripped Jews of citizenship, forbade marriage or sexual relations between Jews and Aryans, and reduced their legal status to that of resident outsiders in their own homeland. And while these laws were framed in the cold bureaucratic language of policy, they were in fact the opening blows of a campaign designed to erase Jewish life from the cultural and economic fabric of Germany. The Nazi propaganda machine, under the direction of Joseph Goebbels, worked tirelessly to make such dehumanization not only acceptable but desirable, saturating the airways with radio broadcasts that wove anti-Semitic rhetoric into news and entertainment alike, commissioning films such as The Eternal Jew to portray Jews as parasites or disease, and reshaping school curricula so that children learned to see their Jewish classmates not as peers, but as threats to the purity and strength of the Volk. This relentless conditioning of the public mind reached one of its most visible and violent expressions on the night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, when Nazi paramilitaries and civilians, encouraged by the state, smashed the windows of Jewish-owned shops, burned synagogues to the ground, looted homes, and dragged men, women and children into the streets, killing at least 91 people and arresting 30,000 more, sending them to concentration camps where brutality awaited. Yet even in the face of international outrage, the regime justified the violence as a spontaneous eruption of the people's will. By the end of that decade, the exclusion of Jews from German life was complete in almost every sphere: economic, educational, cultural, leaving them isolated, impoverished, and marked for something far worse. And as these measures tightened, it became clear that the Nazi state was no longer content with containment or expulsion, for the rhetoric had shifted subtly but decisively toward the language of eradication, laying the foundation for policies that would transform prejudice into industrialized mass murder. What had begun as a political strategy to consolidate power had metastasized into a national creed, enforced not only by the SS and the Gestapo, but by millions of ordinary citizens who, whether through conviction, fear, or opportunism, participated in the machinery of hate, turning neighbours into informants, bystanders into accomplices, and an entire society into the silent engine that would soon drive the most systematic genocide the modern world had ever witnessed. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, the German Wehrmacht crossed into Poland under the pretext of fabricated provocations, unleashing a war that would not remain confined to the contested borders but would, in a matter of months, engulf nearly every corner of Europe, for the invasion was not merely a military manoeuvre to reclaim territory lost in past treaties, but the first step in a grand design to reorder the continent according to the racial and ideological map drawn in Adolf Hitler's mind. A vision in which the so-called Aryan master race would dominate, and all others deemed inferior would either serve, flee, or perish. Poland fell swiftly under the onslaught of blitzkrieg, a new form of warfare combining fast-moving infantry, tanks, and relentless aerial bombardment which shattered defences before they could solidify. And as German troops advanced, they were followed by Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units whose orders went far beyond traditional military objectives, targeting the Polish intelligentsia, political leaders, clergy, and especially Jewish communities, marking the beginning of the mass executions that would, in time, become the Holocaust's signature atrocity. The lightning victories that followed seemed to confirm the invincibility of the Nazi war machine. In April 1940, Denmark and Norway were taken. By May, the armies had swept through the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, before turning their attention to France, whose defences crumbled in just 6 weeks, leaving Paris under occupation and the French government divided between collaboration and exile, while Britain stood alone across the Channel, refusing to yield despite the constant roar of Luftwaffe bombers during the London Blitz. Nights when entire neighbourhoods were reduced to rubble, and the glow of fires lit the horizon like a second malevolent dawn. Yet Hitler's ambitions were never limited to military conquest for its own sake. Every territory seized became a laboratory for implementing the Nazi racial order, with local populations subjected to rigid hierarchies in which ethnic Germans received privileges, while Poles, Czechs, and other Slavic peoples were pushed into forced labour, deported, or left to starve, and Jewish communities were corralled into ghettos, cramped, walled-off districts where disease and hunger were as deadly as the bullets of the occupying forces. The war's expansion also emboldened Nazi policymakers to accelerate plans for what they called the Jewish question, for as the borders of the Reich expanded, so too did the number of people now trapped within the machinery of Nazi control, and the logistical challenge of managing millions of Jews across occupied Europe became the grim prelude to the decision that these populations would not be merely relocated or segregated, but systematically destroyed. Even in the early years of the conflict, signs of this radical shift could be seen in the massacres carried out by the Einsatzgruppen in occupied Poland and later in the Soviet Union, where entire villages were wiped out in a single day, and survivors, if there were any, were forced to dig mass graves before being shot, the earth itself becoming the silent witness to crimes that defied comprehension. By the end of 1941, as the war reached into North Africa and deep into Eastern Europe, it had become clear that this was not simply a clash of armies or a contest for territory, but a war of annihilation, driven by an ideology that viewed conquest as the means and extermination as the end, with every new victory expanding the reach of policies designed to reshape the world into a place where, in Hitler's imagined future, no trace of Jewish life, or of any people he deemed unworthy, would remain to tell the story of what had been lost. By January 1942, the Nazi regime had already spent nearly a decade stripping Jews of their rights, livelihoods, and homes, yet for all the cruelty already inflicted, a decisive and chilling transformation was about to occur. For the policies of exclusion, forced labour, and mass shootings, brutal as they were, had proven, in the eyes of the regime's leadership, too inefficient, too public, and too prone to leaving survivors, and so at a secluded villa on the shores of Berliser-Linz Wannsee Lake, senior officials of the SS, the Nazi Party, and key government ministries gathered to formalise what they called Die Endlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution to the Jewish question, a euphemism so cold and bureaucratic that it masked the reality that what they were authorising was nothing less than the systematic, industrial-scale extermination of an entire people. The Wannsee Conference, orchestrated by Reinhard Heydrich and meticulously documented by Adolf Eichmann, was not the birth of anti-Semitic violence that had long been woven into the fabric of Nazi policy, but it was the moment at which the disparate, chaotic elements of persecution were unified into a centralised, state-run programme of annihilation, one that would stretch across the breadth of occupied Europe and operate with the precision of a well-oiled machine, relying on rail networks, camp systems, and administrative coordination to ensure that millions could be killed in a manner as organised as it was inhuman. In the months that followed, the outlines of this machinery came into horrifying clarity. Ghettos such as those in Warsaw, Łódź and Krakow, already suffocating under starvation and overcrowding, would be liquidated, their inhabitants herded onto freight trains under the watch of armed guards, transported hundreds of miles in sealed cattle cars without food, water or sanitation, until the doors were flung open at places whose names would become synonymous with death: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, each constructed with the singular purpose of killing on a scale the world had never seen. Here, the process was stripped of any pretense of humanity. Arrivals were met by SS officers who, in a matter of minutes, conducted selections that determined who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers and who would be worked to death in the camp's forced labour sectors, and those chosen for death were often told they were being taken for a shower, only to be herded into sealed rooms where pellets of Zyklon B were dropped from above, releasing cyanide gas that would suffocate hundreds at a time, after which the bodies were stripped of hair, gold teeth, and valuables before being fed into crematoria designed to operate day and night. The scale of this operation was staggering. Transports from every corner of Nazi-occupied Europe arrived with mechanical regularity, their timetables coordinated as carefully as if they were delivering goods for industry rather than human beings for slaughter, and this Nazi state, in its relentless pursuit of racial purification, expanded its killing to include not only Jews, but also Roma and Sinti peoples, the disabled political dissidents, Soviet prisoners of war, and homosexuals, each group marked for death under the same cold logic that had defined the final solution from its inception. By the end of 1942, this blueprint for genocide had moved from conference room planning to the grim reality of mass murder on a continental scale, and the Nazi leadership, far from hiding their actions within the inner circles of the regime, boasted privately of their progress, convinced that they were carrying out a historic mission that would be celebrated by future generations, an illusion so grotesque that it revealed the full moral bankruptcy of a system that had replaced human compassion with the ruthless efficiency of death as state policy. At the edge of the Polish town of Oświęcim, where the quiet countryside once rolled in fields and small farms, stood the gates that bore the infamous phrase Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, a bitter and calculated deception that greeted every new transport arriving at Auschwitz, the largest and most notorious of the Nazi death camps. For behind those gates there was no freedom to be earned, only a meticulously engineered system of starvation, forced labour, medical experimentation, and industrialised killing that reduced human life to numbers, hair, teeth, and ash. Auschwitz was not a single camp but a complex of facilities. Auschwitz I, the original concentration camp, Auschwitz II-Birkenau, the primary extermination site, and Auschwitz III Monowitz, a vast forced labour camp tied to the industrial needs of companies such as IG Farben. And together they functioned as a microcosm of the Nazi genocide, a place where arrival meant immediate confrontation with the machinery of death, whether in the form of the selection lines that sent men, women, and children to either the barracks or the gas chambers, or in the form of daily routines designed to extract every possible ounce of labour from the human body before it collapsed. Those who were chosen for work were herded into overcrowded wooden barracks where bunks were stacked 3 high, often infested with lice, and where the daily ration, a crust of bread, a thin soup made from rotting vegetables, and a smear of margarine, was insufficient to sustain life for long, ensuring that disease and exhaustion did as much killing as the SS guards or the gas chambers. And each morning, before the sun had even risen, prisoners were marched out for roll call, standing in the freezing cold or under the blazing summer sun for hours, before being sent to construction sites, gravel pits, or factory floors where beatings and shootings could come for any perceived act of disobedience or simply for collapsing from weakness. Yet even this cruelty was not the camp's most infamous hallmark, for Auschwitz was also the domain of Dr. Josef Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death, whose medical experiments were less about science than about satisfying a sadistic curiosity cloaked in the language of research. Twins were injected with diseases to compare their reactions, children were subjected to unnecessary amputations, and prisoners were exposed to freezing temperatures or toxic chemicals under the pretense of military necessity, all while the victims screamed or lay silent in resignation, knowing that death was often the only release. The gas chambers at Birkenau, disguised as communal bathhouses, could kill up to 2,000 people at a time, and their operation followed a grimly efficient routine. SS officers directing new arrivals to undress, guards assuring them of hot soup or work assignments afterward, doors sealed tight before Zyklon B pellets were dropped through openings in the ceiling, the panic and claw marks on the walls testifying to the final minutes of terror, after which Sonderkommando units, themselves prisoners, were forced to drag the bodies out, remove valuables, and carry them to the crematoria, where the smoke from the chimneys became an unending foul cloud over the camp. In Auschwitz, death was not an aberration or a byproduct of poor conditions. It was the central purpose, the end toward which every detail was aligned, from the train schedules to the quantities of gas ordered, from the construction of new barracks to the expansion of crematoria, and the camp's efficiency was such that it became the model for other killing centres, a blueprint perfected through practice, refined with chilling precision, and defended by the perpetrators as nothing more than the execution of necessary orders. By the time Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, more than 1.1 million people, most of them Jews, had been murdered within its fences, and what they left behind was a landscape of horror so vast that even the liberators struggled to comprehend it. Mountains of shoes, piles of human hair, thousands of abandoned suitcases bearing the names of the dead, each one a fragment of a life that had been reduced, in the eyes of the Nazi state, to an entry on a ledger of extermination, and each one a silent accusation against those who had passed under the gates and found not freedom, but the final and absolute negation of life. On June 22, 1941, under the codename Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler launched the largest invasion in human history, sending more than 3 million German soldiers, accompanied by hundreds of thousands of Axis troops, across an 1,800-mile front into the Soviet Union, shattering the non-aggression pact signed less than 2 years earlier. And in doing so, he not only opened a new brutal chapter of the war, but also unleashed a wave of atrocities that dwarfed even the violence already consuming occupied Europe. For in Hitler's eyes, the campaign in the East was not merely a military conquest but a crusade of annihilation, aimed at destroying Bolshevism, eradicating the Slavic peoples he deemed inferior, and exterminating the millions of Jews who lived in the territories his armies would seize. From the first days of the invasion, the war on the Eastern Front bore the marks of ideological hatred, for orders issued by the High Command and the SS made it explicit that normal rules of warfare would not apply. The Commissar order mandated the immediate execution of Soviet political officers upon capture, while other directives authorized the mass killing of civilians suspected of supporting the Red Army, ensuring that villages were burned, entire communities were slaughtered, and any semblance of restraint was stripped away in favour of terror as a tool of control. In the chaos of rapid advances, vast numbers of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, yet rather than being treated according to the Geneva Conventions, they were herded into open-air camps with no shelter, food or medical care, left to die in the scorching summer heat or the freezing winter cold, and by the war's end, more than 3 million Soviet POWs would perish, many from deliberate starvation, a policy rooted in the Nazi belief that feeding German troops took precedence over preserving the lives of those they regarded as subhuman. But it was the actions of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed in the wake of the Wehrmacht, that marked the most direct and devastating escalation of Nazi policy, for their orders were clear: to seek out and destroy Jewish communities, communist officials and other undesirable elements, and they carried out this mission with methodical brutality, rounding up men, women and children, marching them to ravines, fields or forest clearings, forcing them to strip and then shooting them in groups so that their bodies tumbled into mass graves dug by their own hands or by those who would follow them into death. One of the most infamous of these massacres took place at Babe Yar, a ravine near Kiev, where over 2 days in late September 1941, more than 30,000 Jews were executed by machine gun fire, their bodies filling the chasm until the earth itself seemed to groan under the weight, and similar scenes played out in countless towns and villages across Ukraine, Belarus and the Baltic states, where the sound of gunfire and the cries of victims became as much a part of the landscape as the wind in the trees. The Eastern Campaign turned vast stretches of countryside into open graves, with local collaborators often drawn into the killing, whether out of shared anti-Semitism, fear, or the lure of looted property, and as the front line pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the machinery of extermination followed, laying the groundwork for deportations to extermination camps further west and ensuring that no refuge remained for those marked for death. In the East, the Nazi war became something rawer and more unrestrained than even the horrors of Auschwitz could fully capture, for here the killing was often intimate, carried out face to face, with the perpetrators standing close enough to see the fear in their victims' eyes, and yet the purpose was the same as it was in the gas chambers: to erase entire populations from existence, leaving behind only the silence of the forests and the shallow mounds of earth that concealed, but could never truly hide, the crimes committed in the name of a twisted vision of racial destiny. Long before the gas chambers reached their full capacity, Adolf Hitler and his inner circle understood that to cement their vision of a racially pure Reich, it would not be enough to kill bodies alone. They would have to kill ideas, erase histories, and strip away the cultural and intellectual heritage of those they sought to destroy. For in the Nazi worldview, memory itself was dangerous if it did not serve the ideology of the state. And so the campaign against the Jews, the Roma, the political dissidents, and all others deemed degenerate, extended beyond physical extermination into the realm of cultural annihilation. As early as May 10th, 1933, the warning signs of this war on memory had been made visible when university students, encouraged by party leaders and backed by the propaganda ministry, gathered in public squares across Germany to throw thousands of books onto towering bonfires, their flames fed by the works of Jewish authors, political opponents and modernist thinkers whose words had dared to question authoritarianism, racial purity or nationalist dogma, and in Berlin's Opernplatz, Joseph Goebbels himself addressed the crowd, declaring the symbolic cleansing of German thought, even as the black smoke rising into the night marked the beginning of a purge that would burn far beyond the written page. This campaign of cleansing spread with the Reich's expansion, for wherever Nazi troops marched, cultural institutions were either seized and repurposed or stripped of their treasures, with art galleries emptied of paintings labelled Entartet Kunst, degenerate art, and museums plundered to fill the private collections of Hitler, Goering and other high-ranking officials who saw in their looted Rembrandts, Vermeers and Da Vinci's not only personal trophies but symbols of the dominance they sought to project over the cultural legacies of conquered peoples. Jewish cultural life, vibrant for centuries in cities like Prague, Warsaw and Vilnius, was systematically dismantled. Synagogues were burned or converted to storage facilities, community archives were confiscated, religious artifacts were stolen or destroyed, and musical, theatrical and literary institutions that had once flourished were silenced, their performers and creators either deported to camps or murdered outright, ensuring that their voices would never again challenge the narrative imposed by the Reich. Even in occupied Western Europe, where the Nazis sometimes cloaked their oppression in a veneer of legality, the pattern was unmistakable. Editors were replaced with party loyalists, radio stations broadcast only state-approved messages, and school curricula were rewritten to conform entirely to the ideals of Aryan supremacy, instilling in children a worldview that erased the contributions of Jews, Slavs, and other targeted groups, while glorifying the myth of a noble, ancient German race destined to rule. The destruction of culture was not collateral damage, it was deliberate policy, for the regime understood that if the memory of a people could be erased, if their art, literature, and history could be reduced to ashes, then even the survivors of physical extermination would find themselves wandering in a cultural void, severed from the traditions and narratives that gave their lives meaning and continuity. By 1944, as the war began to turn against Germany, the Nazis redoubled these efforts, looting art from retreating territories, destroying archives that could document their crimes, and burning entire libraries before abandoning cities to the advancing Allies, leaving behind a vacuum of memory as thorough in its devastation as the physical ruins of bombed-out streets. In this way, the genocide perpetrated by the Nazi state was both physical and spiritual, a simultaneous assault on bodies and on the intangible inheritance of generations, and its legacy remains not only in the 6 million Jewish lives extinguished, but also in the incalculable loss of songs never sung again, paintings never seen again, stories never told again, and ideas never allowed to take root. For the flames that consumed those books and the hands that seized those artworks were part of the same machinery of hate that turned trains into cattle cars and gas chambers into factories of death. By the winter of 1943, the grandiose vision of a Tausendjähriges Reich, the Thousand-Year Reich, was already beginning to crumble under the weight of military defeats, economic strain, and the sheer impossibility of sustaining a war on so many fronts. For the catastrophic loss at Stalingrad not only shattered the myth of German invincibility, but also marked the turning of the tide in the east, as Soviet forces began to push the Wehrmacht back, village by village, city by city, reclaiming territory with a relentless determination fueled by both vengeance and survival, while in the west, Allied bombing campaigns reduced German industrial centres to smoking ruins and tightened the noose around the Nazi war machine. In June 1944, Operation Overlord, known to history as D-Day, opened a second front in Western Europe, with Allied forces landing on the beaches of Normandy under a storm of machine gun fire, artillery and air bombardment. And though the cost was immense, the invasion succeeded in establishing a foothold from which American, British, Canadian and other Allied troops could advance eastward, liberating France, Belgium and the Netherlands, driving the retreating German army toward its own borders, and exposing the crumbling infrastructure of a regime that had promised eternal dominance, but now found itself scrambling to delay an inevitable collapse. As the Allies advanced, they uncovered the grim realities that Nazi propaganda had worked so hard to conceal. The liberation of Majdanek in July 1944 and Auschwitz in January 1945 revealed to the world the scale and industrial organisation of the genocide, with heaps of shoes, glasses, hair and ash serving as mute evidence of the millions who had passed through the gates never to return. And for the soldiers who stumbled upon these scenes, the stench of death and the hollow-eyed survivors who could barely stand became indelible reminders that this was not merely a war for territory, but a war against a system that had mechanized murder. Retreating Germans responded with cruelty rather than mercy, forcing prisoners on death marches across frozen landscapes, driving them hundreds of miles with little food or water, shooting those who lagged behind and leaving trails of bodies in the snow, for even in its death throes, the Reich refused to release its grip on those it had condemned, preferring to destroy them rather than allow them to be freed by advancing armies. Inside Germany, morale crumbled as rationing tightened, cities burned from air raids, and the once celebrated Führer became increasingly reclusive, issuing unrealistic orders from the confines of his fortified bunker in Berlin, ignoring the reality reported by his generals and clinging to fantasies of counteroffensives that could turn the tide, even as his most loyal subordinates began to sense the futility of their loyalty and the certainty of their defeat. By April 1945, Berlin was surrounded by Soviet forces from the east and pressured by American, British and French forces from the west. Its streets turned into battlefields, its population sheltering in basements and subway tunnels as artillery shells tore through the city above, and within the Führer bunker, the atmosphere was one of paranoia, resignation and decay, the walls reverberating with the muffled explosions of a world that was closing in on the man who had once promised his people a millennium of triumph. The Reich that had proclaimed itself eternal had lasted just 12 years, collapsing under the combined force of its enemies abroad and the moral rot at its core. And as the noose tightened around Berlin, the machinery of hate that had fueled its rise was now reduced to scattered pockets of resistance, clinging desperately to a cause already buried beneath the rubble, the smoke, and the countless graves it had dug across Europe. On April 30th, 1945, with the streets of Berlin reduced to rubble, and the thunder of Soviet artillery shaking the very walls of the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler, once the self-proclaimed architect of a 1,000-year empire, chose to end his life rather than face capture, retreating to his private quarters with Eva Braun, the woman who had been at his side in the shadows of his public life. And together, in a grim pact of loyalty and despair, they sealed their fate. She by swallowing a capsule of cyanide, he by placing a pistol to his temple and pulling the trigger. The sound of the shot muffled by the chaos outside, yet unmistakable to those in the bunker, who had been waiting for the moment when the Führer's reign would collapse not with a trial or a reckoning, but with the finality of self-inflicted death. The bodies were swiftly wrapped in blankets, carried up the narrow bunker stairs into the shell-shattered garden of the Reich Chancellery, and doused in petrol before being set alight, the flames struggling against the damp spring air as the small group of loyal aides stood watch, following Hitler's instructions to ensure that no enemy, least of all the Soviets, would have the satisfaction of parading his corpse as a trophy, for he was determined to deny the world even that small piece of justice, choosing instead to vanish into ashes and smoke that would mingle with the debris of the city he had doomed. By the time the Soviet troops overran the bunker complex, there was little left of the man whose voice had once commanded stadiums of roaring followers and armies of millions, only charred remains scattered in a shallow crater, soon to be collected, examined, and ultimately buried in secrecy, moved repeatedly over the following decades to prevent the grave from becoming a shrine to the ideology that had brought Europe to the brink of destruction, until finally, in 1970, the last traces were destroyed entirely by Soviet authorities. In the days that followed Hitler's death, the Nazi regime crumbled with astonishing speed, for the surrender of Berlin on May 2nd was followed almost immediately by the unconditional surrender of all German forces on May 8th, bringing an official end to the war in Europe. Though for the millions of survivors of camps, ghettos and forced labour, there was little sense of triumph, only the staggering weight of loss, the knowledge that liberation had come too late for parents, siblings and children who had vanished into the gas chambers and mass graves. Unlike many of his subordinates, Hitler would never stand trial at Nuremberg, never be confronted with the testimonies of those who had endured his policies, never be forced to hear the details of the crimes committed in his name, and never be sentenced for the 6 million Jews, the hundreds of thousands of Roma, the disabled, the political prisoners, and the countless civilians who had perished under his rule. Instead, he escaped the judgment of the living through an act of cowardice disguised as defiance, leaving others to bear the public shame and legal consequences of the regime's actions. For all the destruction he had wrought, Hitler's end was a strangely small and private thing, a brief flash of violence in a hidden room, overshadowed by the immense violence he had unleashed upon the world, and though his body was consumed by fire, the magnitude of his crimes ensured that his name would be burned into history's memory. Not as the leader he imagined himself to be, but as the author of one of humanity's darkest chapters, a man who left behind not a legacy of glory, but a trail of ashes stretching from Berlin to the furthest reaches of the territories his armies had once occupied. In the years that followed the war, the full scope of the Holocaust emerged in fragments, eyewitness testimonies from survivors who had walked through the gates of hell and lived to speak, photographs and films captured by liberators who could scarcely believe what they saw, and the meticulous records kept by the perpetrators themselves, whose obsession with documenting their crimes revealed a chilling absence of shame. 6 million Jews had been exterminated, alongside millions of others, Roma and Sinti, the disabled political dissidents, Soviet prisoners of war, homosexuals, each one a human life reduced by the Nazi state to a statistic, an entry on a death ledger, a pair of shoes left in a heap. The world responded with trials at Nuremberg, with declarations that crimes against humanity would never again be tolerated, with memorials and museums designed to keep the memory alive. Yet history has shown that remembrance alone is not immunity. The seeds of hatred, once planted, can lie dormant for decades, only to sprout again when fear and ignorance create fertile ground. The ideology that fueled Hitler's rise was not some alien force unique to one nation in one moment of time. It was the product of human weakness, the allure of simple answers to complex problems, and the intoxicating promise of belonging to a cause that places blame on others. From the vantage point of a narrator, I cannot help but see in this story a warning carved in fire and ash that the machinery of hate is not built overnight, that its gears turn slowly at first, disguised as policy, as rhetoric, as protection of the majority, till one day it becomes unstoppable, consuming all who stand in its path. It is easy, in the comfort of hindsight, to imagine we would have resisted, that we would not have been silent, that we would have recognised the signs, yet history whispers that most did not, and that silence is itself a form of complicity. The phrase "never again" has been spoken so often that it risks becoming a slogan rather than a vow. To give it meaning, we must recognise the warning signs of dehumanisation in our own time. We must protect the rights of those who cannot protect themselves, and we must refuse to allow fear to dictate who belongs and who does not. For Hitler may be gone, his Reich reduced to rubble, but the shadow of what he built remains, waiting for those willing to step into it. If this story has reached you, if it has made you reflect, question, or remember, then I invite you to stay with us on the Nameless Scribe, where we give voice to the histories that still matter, the ones too often buried under dust or drowned in the noise of the present. Subscribe so that together we can keep these stories alive, not as distant echoes of the past, but as living warnings for the future. Never forget, never again.